because we don't know
Mhm.
about research,
Right.
we are coming in fresh and we are seeing what the researchers are doing from a completely different perspective. And this is where I think people like me, we have the permission to say, why are you doing it that way?
Hi, I'm Caitlin,
And I'm Clarinda,
and
and this is Not Just
Patience,
Patience.
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. Our guest on this episode is Robert Joyce, and we're going to be talking about patient involvement in research, why patients should be more involved, and how they can do so.
Robert has lived with chronic illness all his life, but following a traffic accident in 2014, he was left with debilitating symptoms. No longer able to continue with his work, Robert started his blog, A 30-Minute Life, to share his experiences, and also has a podcast of the same name. In 2019, Robert became involved in clinical research, eventually earning the title of Embedded Patient Researcher and becoming a co-applicant on the trial of a therapy for multiple sclerosis. Although he was not able to continue this role, he is now an advocate for more patients to be involved in research. Thanks so much for joining us today, Robert.
It's my pleasure.
So to start with, based on what I just mentioned about being an embedded patient researcher, could you explain a little bit more about what this means and what your role was in clinical research?
Well, I suppose traditionally patients were only what researchers called participants in research. So whatever the therapy or medicine is, the patients only receive that. But something that has been changing over the last, say, several decades, and started really with AIDS research, was to include patients in the whole process of research.
Mm-hmm.
So by that, I mean deciding what the research question is, then formulating how the research should be done, and then actually doing the research and eventually analyzing it and then sharing that with the world, which is called dissemination. And I was employed as a research assistant on a feasibility study for a new cognitive therapy to help people with multiple sclerosis. And in Ireland, they were coming up with a new system on how to include patients more in the research process. And in the university that I was working in, the University of Galway, they decided that it would be good to have a patient on the management team of the research. And so I was employed as a research assistant. And my role in that was just to be the voice of the patient. So everything that happens within that study, I could hear what was going to happen. And that also allowed me to share my experience of living with multiple sclerosis, so that the way that the study would be conducted would be more suitable for people like me. And the original role was as a research assistant, which is kind of like the bottom level of what it is to be a researcher. But as the trial went on, they realized that actually I had a much bigger role that I could play than they had originally thought. So over that time, and it was 3 years, the whole thing was 3 years, I had done many, many things to do with the recruitment, developing the patient information sheets for post-intervention interviews, training of other research assistants on how to do the benchmarking tests, as well as many other things along the way. And I think really the whole idea is that if the patients are integrated into the research, we can actually help it become better and a higher quality.
Right. What was your work before this?
I did many things over my life, but I was mainly involved in different businesses, either as a manager or an owner, small businesses or large businesses. I got involved with management consultancy for a good period. And that was really my final role before I had that car accident in 2014. So that really changed what I could do.
The reason for my asking that was that it seems like this would have been a new world to you, and this role would have been a new challenge that probably you had not foreseen. And how did you ease yourself into it?
Well, I suppose I was quite fortunate in my history before getting involved in the research, in that I had been involved in many different things, and I had often met obstacles or challenges that I didn't know how to overcome.
Mhm.
So I had learned how to look at those issues and figure out a solution to them and then to move forward.
Right.
So even though I had no background in research, really, I realized that whatever was thrown at me, I knew I could deal with, right?
Mhm.
Now, maybe
Mhm.
not brilliantly, but I was willing to give it a chance. And I remember that first meeting with Dr. Sinead Hines and Dr. Chris Dwyer, who are running the study. Sinead said to me, Robert, would you like to do the patient information leaflet? This is at the very first meeting. Okay. And she said, "You do the patient information leaflet for the study." And I said, what is that? I didn't know what it was. And
Right.
so I asked for examples. Could you show me what it is? And we actually did a SWOT, which is a study within a trial on that, because Dr. Chris Dwyer, who is the postdoc in the study, he
Mhm.
also did a patient information leaflet. And so we put them side by side and we did a randomized trial to see the impact, really, of
Mhm.
the researcher one versus a patient written one. And they were vastly different in the way they looked. Like his
Mhm.
was really like a piece of law. So
Mhm.
really dense, very,
Right.
hard to read, very much for an academic. And mine was very much done for the layperson. So there was lots of space in it, and there was bullet lists, and there was a chart, and there was all things that made it easier to read. And the language
Right.
that I
Right.
used was very different. So it made it much more accessible to the average person. So it was very interesting for my first experience
Mhm.
of being involved in research. We were actually doing some research within the research, and I was part of that.
Right.
And I found that incredibly interesting, incredibly stimulating, and it allowed me to use my experience of
Mhm.
living with multiple sclerosis in a positive way, because like
Right.
all illnesses, they're inherently negative. But
Mhm.
to be able to flip them and twist them into something that actually can be a power for good, I think there's great opportunity in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to hear as well that you had no research experience, but were able to throw yourself into this role. Because I think, at least for me, the research world, if you've never been involved in it, is quite daunting as a patient. I think a lot of the processes and the language and everything is something that feels overwhelming. But obviously, there are research experts who are running the trial, and that's what their role is. But in this situation, your role was to provide your expertise, which is lived experience and being a layperson, and making it more relatable to the people who are going to be involved in the trial.
But there's another benefit that we bring, not just
Mhm.
our lived experience of the conditions, but because we don't know
Mhm.
about research,
Right.
we are coming in fresh and we are seeing what the researchers are doing from a completely different perspective. And this is where I think people like me, we have the permission to say, why are you doing it that way?
Mhm.
Because they're researchers, this is what they've always done. But when somebody new comes in, we actually have a blank piece of paper and we have no preconceptions of the way things had been done before and what we should do now. So we have the power to ask why. And I remember when we were putting together the protocol for the study, we had two arms of the study. One was
Mhm.
the control arm that didn't receive the therapy, and the other group that did. And it was all going to be face to face. So we'd have an occupational therapist that would be teaching the therapy. And I was asking the question, well, why don't we do it online as well? And it kind of put them off a little bit. Like, how could you question the way that we're doing it? And so they talked about that it wasn't the protocol that they had originally done. And to change it means changing a whole load of paperwork. And they didn't want to do that. And they also thought that maybe there was a possibility that the results could be what they call confounded by
Mhm.
external things because they wouldn't have so much control. But what was very interesting, we were discussing that in September, maybe of 2019.
Mhm.
And then in March, the following year, the world
COVID.
changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And suddenly we had to redo everything. And the whole therapy went from a face-to-face intervention to one that's online. And they actually were forced to make that change. Now, maybe if I had a stronger voice at the time, I could have maybe pushed a bit further to actually have 3 arms of the study. And that kind of taught me a lesson that sometimes you need to be a little bit more firm in what you are requesting. And this also creates an issue for new patient advocates who want to get involved in this. If you are not used to asking those difficult questions or challenging the norm, it's hard for you to perform the role. And I was lucky in the experience that I had previously in my life that I wasn't intimidated by maybe academia or the institution or the system. And I feel that maybe when somebody new is getting involved, that they ought to have somebody who has a bit of experience with them when they're starting. Not for that person to say anything, but to just be like their support so that they won't be intimidated. They feel like they have somebody there that they can help them in the process. Because my fear is that it will only be those that are outspoken, those that are willing to be like me, but we need the whole variety of people involved in research, because otherwise we are not getting that true representation of what the patient community is.
Yeah, agreed totally. And I think on the back of that, you've spoken a little bit to the benefits of having patients involved in the research. And I just wondered, in terms of the benefit to the researchers who are conducting the research, what benefits does it have to have a patient embedded in that team?
It builds trust. And how does it build trust? First of all, one of my roles in that study was to produce a newsletter for the participants. And in that newsletter, I was very obviously the editor, and I said that I had multiple sclerosis. So already there is a natural link between me and the participants. But also, because they know that I am part of the team, they naturally have trust in me because I'm part of their community. And because I'm now kind of in with the research community, it builds a bit more trust. But there's one example of one thing that happened during the study that really highlights how that trust is not necessarily visibly or maybe orally presented, but by the procedure of the study, it is shown that the study is more suitable for people with MS. So before we started actually doing the intervention, they had produced a manual for the participants. And this manual was a lovely book, beautifully presented, like really lovely. And I had a look at it and I went through the pictures and I said, you know, you can't give this to people with MS. And they said, why? What's wrong with it? And I said, well, people with MS, we have problems with our hands. You know, touch is bad. Some people can have a tremor in your hand. You can have loss of strength in your limbs. So if you present somebody a book that they have to hold open that doesn't stay flat on the table for somebody with MS, and they're saying, you're expecting me to learn from this? How could you give me a book that is not suitable for somebody like me? So I said, we need to have something that has a ring on it and that lies flat on the table so that when you turn the page, it's very easy.
It stays.
And they were like, why didn't we think of that? And I said, because you don't live with these hands. You don't know what it's like to live your everyday with multiple sclerosis. And so they really questioned me on it and they could see the merit in what I was saying. And then we said, okay, we'll present this then to our patient advisory panel, which consisted of 6 people with various different levels of MS or carers. And they agreed 100% with the change. And not only that, they came up with other suggestions that would make that booklet even easier to use for people with MS. So now, when the patient comes to be taught the therapy, it is suitable for them. And they don't have this harboring of mistrust in the researcher. And so the patients end up being more interested in what they're studying. They're become more engaged. They're more likely to stay the length of the trial. So we actually had something like 95% retention in the
Wow.
study,
Mhm.
which was like
Wow.
unbelievable for
Mhm.
a therapy, right?
Right.
So it's all of these little things that build up that trust that makes the participant think, yeah, they're interested in me. They know what it's like to live my condition. The equipment and how they're being taught is tailored to the MS audience, not to a general audience. And so we have a truer image of what the effectiveness of the therapy is.
Thanks, Robert. I think that that was a fantastic example of the value that a patient can add, and it just goes beyond anything you would ever see in a research protocol, a study protocol, and it's just so nuanced that it's literally impossible for researchers to even imagine it if, like you said, if they don't have the patient's hands. So I think that that was really cool. So you briefly touched upon the different ways in which patients can be involved, and maybe you can elaborate on that a bit, and also how they might become involved.
So there's many stages in research, and there are different roles for different types of people. Okay, so everybody can contribute in their own way. So what I've already just described is my role that as a research assistant or an embedded patient researcher. So that is one role, but you could also be a co-applicant for the study. So this is when you're coming up with the idea of what should be researched. Okay. And this is where patients, I think, should have a very big role in that we should be liaising with researchers on a regular basis so that the researchers can know what are the needs of the patient community at this point. And oftentimes I see research is being done because it is the cool or the sexy thing to do, and it is the current trend. And yes, that is very important. But what does the patient actually need? Like for people with multiple sclerosis, fatigue is an issue. Mobility is an issue. Problems with your bladder, cognitive stuff. These are all things that maybe don't need a pill, but the change that it would make to the lives of the patient if those things were resolved is huge. So if the patient community is able to gather together and say, this is what we need to have researched, and this is the way we want to have it researched. Okay, so that's one step. And then one of those patients becomes a co-applicant on the study. And that means that as it's written, that a patient is actually saying, yeah, no, I think that's right to having it. No, this is wrong. We should change this. This will be a better way of putting this together. And when that goes to funding, oftentimes there are also patients assessing that document to see if the patient is included. So if the patient is included in the putting together, that may make the proposal easier to get funding. Then you move on to actually having an embedded patient researcher, but you also have focus groups. You also probably have a patient advisory panel. And that, say, patient advisory panel would consist of maybe 6 to 10 people. And they are with the study for its duration, but they would only be spoken to maybe 5 or 6 times over the course of the study, based on a question that the researchers have that they don't really know what is the right way to approach something, and they would go to that group of people. Now, how do you get involved with this? How do you perform this role? Well, in Ireland, we have a thing called PPI Ignite, and that is an organization which is there to help incentivize or support researchers to include the patient in research. And you can go to them in the various different universities and put your name down and say, yes, I would be interested. And they will let you know when researchers are looking for patients. But you also have the research that is done by pharmaceutical companies. And that's a different thing. And so you need to become engaged more with that grouping. So in Ireland, we have an organization called IPOSI, which is a representative organization, which is part pharma, part academic, part maybe policy stuff to do with governmental stuff. That is a representative organization, and I'm a member of that in Ireland. And then IPOSI is a member of UPATI, and that's an organization that trains patients, and I believe both of you have been involved in this and have become fellows of Patty, like myself. And that introduces us to a European context, and actually even wider now because it's going worldwide.
Mhm.
And so you can link into pharma research then maybe a little bit easier. But there's also roles with health technology assessment. So the European Medicines Agency needs patients to review the new therapies to see if they are something that actually the patient community needs. So there are many different points along the way. I've been involved with the HSE, which is the Health Service Executive in Ireland, and they are the managers of the health system in this country. And
Mhm.
I was on one of their committees on how they govern research within the HSE and how they're putting in their new systems. And the pleasure of being part of that is that I can make sure that in their systems that the patient is part of the process. And so that when the researchers are looking to get their research approved within the state system, the patient has a role in that function, not as recipients of whatever the therapy is, but actually putting together the process by which that research is done. So now you do need to work at this. You need to maybe get a little bit of knowledge. You need to start engaging with these organizations, and so that they can see you, right? So that they realize you're there. Unfortunately, there isn't this marketplace or community where researchers and patients can come together, because very often the groups for patients are closed, the researchers are closed, and we don't meet, and we need to build a bridge between these two communities, because I feel that ultimately we are not on different teams. And for this adversarial system to be in place where we're two different camps, I think is wrong. I think we are the one camp trying to find a solution to whatever this illness and what it's causing us. And I think that is something that it's going to take time to develop. Because we're still really in the very early stages of patient involvement in research. It's only now that they're starting to see, oh, there is a benefit. Yes, having this patient performing a role within this research is improving the quality of the research. It is reducing the cost because we're making less mistakes. And that learning is almost exponential, because once it happens in one study in an institution, that learning can be passed on to all the other research that is happening in that research, or even outside of it, because this is not something that is protected by some kind of copyright. It's not some intellectual property. It is just a way of being, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's clearly some really mutual benefits and mutual goals between researchers and patients. But it does require, I suppose, both the patient to make themselves known, sign up to those groups and say, I'm willing to partake in research. And it takes the researchers to go to those groups and say, hey, I'm looking for an example for an MS patient. I think one thing, just from my own personal experience, that I wanted to add as an option is that patient organizations for specific diseases sometimes also have PPI groups, patient and public involvement groups. So, for example, I have cystic fibrosis, and the CF Trust is the organization in the UK, and I've joined their PPI group. And therefore, that means that actually, when a lot of researchers are Googling, they're unlikely to find my name or anyone else's specific name, but they might go to the CF Trust and say, do you have anyone who would be interested in this? And they can act as a middleman as well. So I think disease-specific patient groups are also another channel that could be used for that, if they exist. I know that Ireland and the UK are at the forefront of this a little bit. I don't know, Clarinda, if you're aware of any in India.
So I would say that India is quite far back, perhaps. And while there might be patient groups for specific disease areas, I would not necessarily imagine that they are involved in research per se. That angle is missing a little bit. But as in my case, for example, I happen to find a global group that supports my disease, which is the Sumaira Foundation. And it makes it easier for me to get involved potentially in trials or in research at a global scale, because now the pharma companies that are doing research in this rare disease are aware of the Sumaira Foundation, and they will contact the Sumaira Foundation for any opportunities for patient involvement. And then if I filter by location and the purpose and the goals of the study, then I can be able to determine where I might fit in. So it does take some work to find where you might be able to set up your roots, as it were, in this space. But it's not impossible to do no matter where you are in the world, I think.
The challenge is for the rare diseases,
Yeah.
whereas the more common illnesses in the country, there usually is some kind of grouping that has been set up. But
Right.
when you're talking about rare diseases, you're talking about international. And then you also have the added difficulty is if there ever is a clinical trial for what you're doing, that research needs to be done internationally.
Right.
And it is getting that commonality of procedure across different countries, because every country has different systems. And even from hospital to hospital, we have different systems. So to getting all of those things to align, it creates a huge challenge.
Yeah.
All of this speaks a lot to this project that I'm working on that I want to share. It's called the Rare Disease Research Network. It's a novel partnership between CamRare and the Patient-Led Research Hub. And we've gotten a grant to build this kind of network for the rare disease space. So a network that connects patients to researchers and funders and allows patient-led research to move forward. This project is still at its infancy, but we should be launching the network. It's mainly UK focused, but it should be launching by the end of November. So that's exciting. It's just
Very cool.
one example of something that's coming up in the space, and hopefully, that takes off more globally, that concept. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely brilliant to have something like that is a stepping stone in getting us to the right place. And I think the idea of doing it in rare diseases actually makes a lot of sense, because it's a very small community. You're talking about a small bunch of researchers, a small bunch of patients, and the connection between those two groups can be very natural. It is a lot less contrived than it would be if it's on those bigger illnesses. Now you do, of course, have the likes of, say, in Ireland, we have the Cancer Society, and they are funding research, right? And so there is that in I suppose, where patients are trying to help decide what is going to be researched. But I think what you're doing is a great idea. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, sounds fantastic.
Please let it work.
So, Robert, as a champion of patient involvement in research, are there some exciting initiatives that you've been involved in that you'd like to share?
Well, I suppose, first of all, UPATI is really amazing as an organization. And the fact that people can train, they can learn about the system of research without having to pay a single euro. They can get that knowledge so that when they are engaging with the research community, that it isn't a language that you're unfamiliar with. And there's a great power in that, because language is what unites us. And when we are using words that are unfamiliar, it creates a barrier between people. So the more we speak a common language, the better it is. I think that is very powerful. And the connection between UPATI and pharma and academia, I think that's really building. I think in Ireland, the PPI Ignite network that we have here is really fantastic in that it is supporting researchers and patients so that we can speak that common language and that we can work together.
Thanks, Robert. It's really heartening to know that there are promising initiatives that are looking to bring patients more deeply into research. I wanted to come back to your own story a little bit. You mentioned that you've not been able to continue with your research work. Could you talk about that a little bit and the challenges that you're facing?
One issue that I have had is that because of my medical issue, I'm in receipt of a welfare payment called invalidity pension. And one of the rules of that pension is that I'm not allowed to do any paid or voluntary work unless I get specific permission from the Department of Social Protection. And to get permission to do something is extremely onerous, even if it's only for 10 minutes. You can't even do voluntary work.
Wow.
Okay. Without specific permission. And then when you get that permission, in the letter that you receive saying, yes, you have permission, they say, but now because you are doing some work, we have now a right to start reassessing your case to see if you're still entitled to your invalidity pension. Okay. So for the last year and a half, I'm not allowed to do anything to do with research at all. Now, what we are doing, though, in Ireland is we are trying to change the rules so that this isn't the case. And we've got a coalition of partners, including the HSE, PPI Ignite, IPOSI. We've also gotten the European Patients Forum involved in it. So it's across Ireland. It's also international. And we're hoping to see if we can change the rules so that anybody who is in receipt of a payment in relation to illness or chronic disease, that they would be allowed to be involved in research. Okay. Because it's so important. And particularly given that you've got the Department of Health is saying, we want patients involved in all of this. But on the other side, you've got the state saying, but we won't let you, right? You're not allowed. So we're in the process of that at the moment. And hopefully we will get the rules changed. But that problem is there all over the world. And I feel that if we get this resolved in Ireland, we can share that story outside of the country. And that it will show to other countries there is a way that you can include the patients and still for them to be in receipt of their supports. Because the one thing that I will not risk is my access to healthcare, my access to the income support. Because in that car accident that I had, I was symptom-free of multiple sclerosis for 10 years, not a symptom. And after the accident, my mobility started getting worse, but I also have a pain on the side of my head. It is a constant pain of a level 5 out of 10 on the pain scale. It does not change. And for example, this talking that we have, this causes that pain to increase. And so my optimum is 30 minutes. And that's why I called my blog a 30-minute life. Because I have to live in 30-minute blocks. If I go past that 30 minutes, that pain gets worse to an extent that it's like a migraine. I cannot do anything. I literally have to go into a darkened room and it will take me 12 to 24 hours to recover from that. Okay. So I cannot do a normal job. It's just not possible. And because of my mobility problems, I cannot use my body. So I can't think. But I can't physically do something because of my mobility problems because of my MS. So I need that financial support from the government, right? And I cannot do anything that would jeopardize that. And as a result, I can't be involved in research. It could be construed that this podcast could be considered work.
Voluntary work, right.
So if this is unlocked, then it opens up a whole community of people who have been silenced that do want to be involved in research because they do want to have their conditions improve medically. And the only way they can do it is be involved in the research.
Absolutely. And firstly, Robert, thank you so much for joining us today. We were obviously already so grateful that you were joining us and sharing your experiences with us. It's been so valuable. And now that we understand that firstly this has caused you some pain, probably looking at the time, and we've gone over 30 minutes, and also that it might cause some political issues for you maybe with your welfare, we're extra grateful for, I suppose, the sacrifice that you've made. So thank you. So just for our listeners, we're now having a second recording session with Robert just to accommodate his condition. So thanks for coming back to us, Robert. I just wanted to pick up on where we left off before. So you spoke a little about the specific challenges that you've had in getting back into research. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the broader challenges that patients may have in getting involved in research.
Well, there's also the issue of payment for patients. And up to now, the researchers felt that if we got paid, somehow our experience was tarnished. Okay. They felt that we were biased because we want the money. And that's the only reason why we're doing it. And we'll say whatever we have to say so that we get the money. But that's not really the case. Patients, we ought to be paid, and we ought to be paid at the same rate as the researchers that are on the team. I have asthma. and I'm 55 years old. I've had that all my life. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the age of 22, right? So I've had that for 30 plus years.
Mhm.
I've had this chronic pain for the last 10 years, right? So I have a huge amount of experience of what it's like to be sick. But also, I've had to engage with the health systems and see how they work or don't work. So if they don't hear my voice, they don't know what it is that they're doing wrong. They think they're doing everything perfect, right? And if we can change that, oh my God.
I do agree that the research community really needs to recognise that expertise and value, because it will improve trust, build confidence, which will improve recruitment, it will improve adherence, and that overall improves the outcomes of the studies. And outcomes of the studies, as we all know, means that the drugs are better for the patients, but also they're more commercially viable for the researchers as well. So it benefits everyone to have this.
Robert, you've spoken a lot about the evolution of patient involvement in research and how things are changing in a positive way. What do you think still needs to be done?
That's a very complicated question, Clarinda, because as the industry develops, as more people become involved, there are more steps that have to be taken. So I think really at the moment, we're just concentrating on getting industry in particular, because I think academia has accepted using patients a lot, but getting industry to engage with patients in a meaningful sense. There's a lot of still very tokenistic use of patients where it's almost like a marketing ploy that they say, well, we've engaged with patients in the development of whatever this medicine is. But really, they're not engaging with patients on what is the topic of the research. It's more like, how are we going to market this product? And can we use the fact that you were part of the team to promote what we're doing? But we need to really grow that, the integration of the patient throughout the research process. And this actually needs real support from industry itself. And this is where the meetings that happen, I think actually casually between patients and industry at conferences will help industry to understand maybe the benefits of including patients. But there is a very good conference that happens. It's a kind of an invite-only conference called POF, the Patient Engagement Open Forum. They are trying to get industry, policymakers, clinicians, and patients all in the one conference together, so there is that meeting of minds. And that's very difficult to do, because you need to have, first of all, somebody who's interested from industry to come. But what I've noticed is that there are certain funders out there who are insisting on a certain degree of patient involvement, and they are actually putting budgets in place. And I know of actually one funder who says 5% of their budget is for patient involvement, and it's a fixed amount. And they actually, as part of their checking of the use of their funds, they sit as observers at some of the trial management meetings to ensure that the patients are at those meetings and that the language that is being used is suitable. And if there is a language barrier because of the technology, that they actually will employ somebody to assist that patient so that they can become more effective in their engagement. But I really think we need to pull all of this back to the very beginning in deciding what are the research questions? What are we researching? And this, where we need a kind of a marketplace, we need a forum where researchers and patients can meet together in a comfortable way and have those frank, honest discussions about what the needs of the patient community are, but also what are the restrictions that research has? What can it do and what can't it do? So there isn't that unreasonable expectation from the patient side that, oh, we're talking to researchers, we're going to get this done. There needs to be that openness. And I think there's a degree of reluctance, to be honest, in those conversations. And that leads to unreasonable expectations.
Yeah.
I was involved with something with the European Academy of Neurology, where they were putting together a paper on what are the research topics that need to be done in neurology, right? And in that paper, they were talking to clinicians, what clinicians felt were the questions, but they didn't, as part of it, go to the patient community and ask them what they needed. And they didn't actually go to the funders and say to the governments, what are the things that as a government you would like to see answered? Because government will fund research if it means that their patient population is healthier and then they can become more integrated into society. So we need to get all these stakeholders together. And I think the big driver of all this is the funders, because ultimately whoever's paying for the research will want to make sure that their euro or dollar or rupee or whatever it is that they're using is being used as effectively as possible and gives the most impact. And the danger is then, of course, when you're doing that, it will always be those headline illnesses like cancer and stuff. And the rare diseases will get lost in that equation because you're talking about a small population, and the medicines for that small population tend to be very expensive because all the research costs has to be pushed into a small amount of patients. So there needs to be a funding mechanism that allows for a percentage of research funding as a whole going to rare diseases so that they're not left out in this equation. We need, as patients and the patient and public involvement fraternity or grouping, we need to be engaged with those funders so that they will start putting as a prerequisite of their funding that you have patient involvement. Researchers will go where the money is. And if the money comes with this requirement that you need to be more inclusive, well, that's what it's going to happen. And after a while, it becomes a habit. I even think we need to push this even further back the chain when children are being educated at school, where the children need to be taught that in order to learn something, you need to engage the people who will be using that learning in the process. So, for example, if you're learning about mathematics, wouldn't it be great to have an engineer in saying, well, I'm using this mathematics so that I can actually design this thing, right? And if we have that habit of engaging the users of whatever it is being designed there in primary school and secondary school and on into university, well, then it becomes natural for when those students become researchers. Of course, we include the people who will be using this because that's what we did at school. So we need to be pushing it further and further back into education. And I think that's really where the big win will come. But we're then talking about 2-3 generations' time. But we have to now get policymakers to start thinking in that way, right? We also have the issue of measurement of the impact of involving patients in research. And I know in the work that we were doing in Galway, we've drafted a paper, it's been submitted for publication on how you assess the impact of patient involvement in research.
Oh, fantastic.
And this is different from all the other measures that have been out there where they mainly focus on the impact on the researcher, right? Or maybe the research, but we're actually including the impact on the patient and how that can actually impact the research. And then the next thing is once you're measuring it, and this is the problem with research takes years, like we're talking 10 years to have something happen. And you don't want to have the learnings of how you engage the patient properly in research waiting for 10 years before it's released into the community. You want to have it as it's happening. So this is where we need to change the story as well. How do you get researchers to kind of lay bare what they have learned, the mistakes that they've made, the areas where they've succeeded, and share that in the research community?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a lot, but I wondered if I could just jump back. You spoke a lot about funders, and I was wondering if you could explain exactly who those people are and how the patient community can collaborate with them.
This is tricky. actually, because we're not naturally connected to funders. So the main funders of research are private foundations that fund it. So say like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they would fund research. Okay. Then you also have governmental funding. So I know in Ireland, we've got the Health Research Board, and that is funded by government, and they engage researchers to do different types of research. And it's not just in academia. They also do stuff, policy stuff. They also have, let's say private groups that might look for funding with them. So you have that, and then you have the big pharmaceutical companies, and that can be a little bit strange too, in that you have the pharma company, they will fund their own stuff, but sometimes they actually have a foundation attached to the company that will fund other stuff. But how do you get in touch with them? And this is the real issue. I don't have an answer for that. I don't really know how that can become more effective. And this comes back again to the problem that patients have engaging with this community. People forget we are sick. We have health issues. And that really restricts our ability to get out there and engage with pharmaceutical companies. I know I would love to go to the various neurological conferences that happen in Europe or in the United States. I'd love to go to ECTRIMS and ACTRIMS in the United States. And there you will meet the funders. But I can't afford to go there. And not only can I not afford it, even if I did have the money, the physical impact of me of being at a conference for 3 days or 4 days is phenomenal. Like, it's just out of orbit. Like, I know myself, I was at a conference, and this is a couple of years ago, and the pain meds that I was taking, and then I was taking stimulants to keep me awake. And I was, it was just like I was so drugged up just so that I could keep going. And then it took me nearly a month to recover from it. And it was only there like, 3 days, 2 or 3 days. But the physical impact on my body was massive. Now, it was great. Don't get me wrong. And there's definitely a value to doing it. But we as patients, it's not always possible to do these things. So the only patients that do go are ones that are being funded by pharma because they're already engaged with the process, or they are privately wealthy enough to go to these things. But then they're not really representative of the patient community because they have a completely different access to healthcare than the general person has. And this is where I think there is a problem, that in order for us to really become one in this community, there needs to be a way of permitting us to get to these events. And the industry needs to have some kind of mechanism, like scholarships or bursaries, that will help us to do this. The problem is they don't see us as sick. So they don't really understand what our needs are. But in order for us to be operating at our maximum in this conference, we need to have everything golden beforehand. And during the process, all those other things have to be resolved for us so that we don't even have to think about them, right? Things like mobility scooters, having your breakfast in your room instead of having to go down to the general place for breakfast. Access to toilets, small things that if you're healthy, you don't even think about it. It's not an issue. But if you are sick, they become monumental. So we need to try and resolve that as an issue. Industry, are they going to pay that? Will they see a benefit now? Does that fit into their return on investment? It's a long-term investment. It's not a short-term, big bang for your buck.
It was a really interesting point you made about perceptions that if, as patient advocates, we show up at conferences or in industry, or we're trying to establish those partnerships, perception is that these are not the sickest patients, perhaps. And I could relate to everything you said about traveling to conferences. And I mean, I know the strain, but it's so clear that the people we meet don't know that. And they see us as a representative of patients, but not like the worst of them necessarily. And the fortunate patients, as it were. And I do think that I am fortunate, but the truth is that there is a huge burden on patient participation in all of these things that kind of goes unaccounted for. And I think that that's really important, that yes, we're not just patients, but we are also patients. And I don't think that either of the two can be forgotten.
And I actually have mentioned this: when you engage a patient in research, 10% of the value of that patient is their illness. The 90% value is their life experience and what they have learned over the years. So we all have individual expertises that has nothing to do with the fact that they were sick, right? If industry can tap into those two things, not only our experience of being ill and how it impacts our lives, but how we have learned to adapt our world so that we can do whatever our work life is or our social life is. And that can be of tremendous value to researchers in how they run their protocols, how they communicate with the participants in the study, how they think about the impact of the side effects of the medicines that they are developing. So there's a balance going on here. But I think the skill base of these patients, like us, is not just our illness.
We are indeed not just patients. Thanks so much, Robert. This has been really enlightening for me, and it's been great to hear about your experiences, your view on everything, and your advice as well. And I think, as someone who didn't know a lot about the research world, it's been really, really helpful to understand that in a bit more detail. So thank you so much for coming on our podcast. We want to ask you a couple questions just to finish off. So if you had one piece of advice for other patient advocates who want to be involved in research, what would that be?
Just do it. Just get out there and do it. All the obstacles that you see are like ropes made of sand. They're only there in your head. As a patient, you have a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience that is incredibly valuable. And never underestimate the value of your experience, and never underestimate the value that you can contribute to research and also to society. I know it's scary because it's a new thing, and you're meeting new people and it's a new world, but just see it as an adventure. You will learn from them, but they will learn from you. And I think that's where you will get your greatest joy. It is really crap being sick. But if you can turn that into something that is precious and of value, and you can use that to change maybe not your life, but the life of other people, the purpose that gives you in your day is so valuable. And I know myself, when I started, I did not realize the benefit I would get emotionally and psychologically from being engaged in this process.
I love that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Everything that you said just sounded so uplifting as a way of life and a way of being for a patient. What would be your advice for other stakeholders who want to engage patients, especially in research?
So Yeats wrote a poem called Circus Animal Desertion. And in that poem, he was lamenting the fact that he'd lost his muse, his ability to write poetry. And in the final lines of that poem, he wrote, "We must go where all ladders start, to the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." And it is that going to where it's dirty and messy and uneven and chaotic that you actually find those things that give you inspiration, and you find the answers to your problem. And in answering your question, I'm saying to researchers, you must go where we are. Go to where we find our tough times. Go to those places where we are experiencing those challenges as patients. Meet us there, and there you will get your inspiration, and there you will find those golden jewels of opportunity for research. And you will be impacting patients in a way that you cannot imagine, because you will be solving the problems that we encounter every day. So by that, I mean, go to the hospitals, be there in the waiting rooms, get to talk to people and see what they're thinking. try and get involved with the chat groups on WhatsApp or on Facebook. Go to our closed groups and ask to be involved in it, and say that you are a researcher and the whole purpose of your journey is to find out what are the needs of patients. And it's going to be rough. You're going to get abuse. You're going to get people, complaining about all sorts of stuff. But once you get over that, once you get past through that messy, disturbance and chaos, you will actually start to hear those real needs of the patient community that we need to get resolved. And you will also build that trust because you were brave enough to come to us where we are. Go where all ladders start. The foul rag and bone shop of the heart. I just think it's magical.
That's a beautiful line.
But yeah.
Yeah, never heard it before. Feel like crying listening to everything you just said. Thank you, Robert. This has been amazing. I just enjoyed this conversation so much.
Yeah, it was a really fantastic conversation. Thanks so much, Robert. So, Clarinda, I wonder if you and I could just talk a little bit about what our top takeaways were from the episode.
I think Robert gave us some very tangible examples of the value that patient involvement can bring to research. And that benefit is not just to patients, but hugely to researchers as well. All stakeholders, really, because the return on research investment is just so high when patients can contribute, and then the domino effect that gets triggered, the benefits are exponential there.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I was maybe unsure about before we had this conversation is, I know it's valuable, but how would patients get involved, or how would researchers reach out? And it does appear that there isn't maybe a universal process for that, but there are loads of channels that people can use to get in contact, either through some third party like UParty, or country or disease specific organization.
Right.
And it's maybe not so easy, but there are lots of ways for it to be done, and hopefully those processes will get easier.
Right. And I don't think that we can really ignore the barriers. Robert's own story about his disability benefit and the fact that that can be jeopardized by him doing work. I don't know what the situation is worldwide, but if it is similar, then that's a huge dichotomy that needs to be resolved, because the reason patients are getting a disability benefit is for absence from a different kind of work, whereas this work exists because they're patients, and that fact cannot be ignored. And the other interesting challenge that he spoke about that also aligned with what we spoke about with Bronwyn on a previous episode, which is that patients deserve to be paid at par with researchers and others involved in the research. But an interesting additional angle that Robert brought in was the perception that if patients are paid, they'll say whatever you want them to, and that's really just not true.
Absolutely. Also, just speaking to that, because it's such a huge barrier, it is really preventing the right people from getting involved. And there's already issues in research about diversity and inclusion. And that probably stems from the research groups and even maybe the patients who are involved not having that diverse perspective. And therefore, it's really hard to recruit for diverse perspectives. So I think that'll be something that's really important to get the patient voice involved, but also to make sure that that's a diverse patient voice that's being involved too.
Right, that's a great summary.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been Not Just Patients with our guests Robert Joyce and your hosts Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Stranger.